I was born and raised in the great city of Cardiff, and I come from a very loving working class Pakistani family. And like many British Asians, my father arrived to the UK in the 50s, in the late 50s. He first came to Sheffield. He came here as an economic migrant because, of course, there was a massive, post-war labour shortage in the mills in the north, and of course the factories here in the south. He came to see his cousin in Bridgend, and he basically fell in love with the South Wales valleys because he said that they reminded him of being home, and the fact that the communities in South Wales at the time were really close-knit. And of course, all of the luscious green valleys, so he decided to lay down roots and settle. And then later on, some years later, about 6-7 years later, he returned to Pakistan. He'd arrived to the UK when he was engaged. So he went back and married my mum, and they both came back here and began to raise a family. So my father worked in the Port Talbot Steelworks, and my mother was like the local Avon salesperson, and eventually she ended up setting up her own business, specializing in Asian fabrics. And like many people from South Asian backgrounds, my parents were really keen on owning their own home, and eventually, getting to a position where they could be mortgage free. So in addition to their day jobs that they had, my parents would buy properties that needed some work doing on them, that were pretty much sometimes falling apart, work on certain parts of the house where we could then move in and live in. And when they weren't working, they were working on the property. And so as a result of that, we moved around quite a lot, and eventually, I think the last time we moved as a family, my parents moved, should I say, was in 2000. So this is the longest we've had a sort of pose as sort of family home. But as a young person, growing up, for me, it wasn't easy because there were very few people who looked like me. And were from my background, and one of the things our parents always taught us was humanity first before anything else. So even though we were raised as Muslims, we were raised to be extremely respectful of other people's traditions and other people's religions and faith, or even no faith. So we were always, wherever we lived, we were always very supportive of our neighbours, and wider community members as well. So it was tough. It wasn't easy. Of course, definitely had plenty of instances of racism and discrimination growing up. We had many instances of, having racist graffiti on the side of our house. It was the 80s and then the early 90s. So it was tough. It was tough for a lot of people. You had to, at times, of course, you had to be ready to defend yourself outside. And then gradually, as you get older, you learn to, protect yourself and stand up for yourself in a different way to the way that maybe you did as a young person. So, funnily enough, I was about 14 years old, and I was on my way. I was in high school by then. I was on my way to school. I was with a friend of mine, and she was actually part white Welsh and Greek. So we kind of formed a bond, I think, because of the fact that we had different ethnicities and something that made us who we are. But we were on our way into school, and basically somebody gave us a flyer, and I still, funnily enough, I still have that flyer, and I think that was kind of the point of real change for me. So my father was a trade unionist, and he was a health and safety rep. So when, growing up in the times of Thatcher and everything that happened within the industry that he worked in, of course, there was times when he was on strike. So I knew what it meant to, what solidarity looked like. I knew what it meant to be supportive of other people, even when you were struggling yourself. And of course, I grew up at a time when, as well, coming from a South Asian background, you come from the history of partition, and you pick up bits of information from the elders around you about how life was like then, and what happened when partition, what was life like when we all lived in the one country, and then what happened as a result of partition. And actually, my mother's family were, by the time the announcement was made that partition was going to happen, it was actually her Hindu neighbors who smuggled them over because they missed the deadline for leaving. So, it's really fascinating, that kind of the history of it all. And actually, my uncle married a Hindu woman. She never converted to Islam or anything, and they had children. We actually don't even know what happened to them, that family, because he stayed behind with his family. Now, so you grow up with all of that, you experience the racism that you're experiencing, and then I get given this flyer, and this flyer basically chimed very much well with what I was seeing happening where we were growing up. And it basically said that the BNP, the British National Party at that time, were setting up a group for young people. And what this group was trying to do was to counter that. So it literally, the flyer says, keep Nazis out of Cathays. And so there was like this PO box number on there. In those days, of course, there was no email. So I wrote this PO box and I said, I want to get involved. I want to know more. Wrote twice. They never came back to me. So instead, my friend and I decided that we were going to set up our own anti-racist grassroots group at school. And everything kind of moved since. So we just started campaigning on all sorts of things. But the other thing, of course, then the big change that happened was, I was barely 18 and, Stephen Lawrence was murdered. And that had a massive impact on what I did next. I became much more politically active. I would, go to London for a range of different solidarity meetings and so forth. And then, of course, I had my own experiences of experiencing racism in the workplace. Again, when I was 18, up until that time, I'd been supporting and working within my mother and by then my sister's fabric business. But I applied for, there was an advert in a shop window, and they said they were looking for retail assistants. And I thought, well, and they even said no experience required. And I was thinking, well, I've even got experience, so I'll go and apply. I went in and the woman said, she said, well, the jobs have gone. And I said, well, the note is still in the window. And she walked over to the window and she took the note down and she said, no, there's no jobs. Now, a day later, another friend of mine was in Cardiff City Centre. She was in town, and we had spoken previously, and I'd said there'd been this job, and they said that it'd gone. So she saw this advert again. So she went inside to the same shop, and they basically offered her the job. Now, she had no experience, no nothing. So I decided at that point that actually I'm going to do something about this. So I put a formal complaint in, and against, I went to the Race Equality Commission at the time, and I basically put a formal complaint in. I got an apology back from them, and in fact, they offered me a job, which I obviously turned down. But my activism then, after that, I went to university. I was the first person actually in my family to go to university, which was a really big moment actually. But I kind of, at that time, of course, we had, 9/11 happened, then 7/7 happened, and that impacted many people in lots of different ways. I became much more aware of, particularly, when 7/7 happened, and the police decided that they were going to apply the practice of shoot to kill. So I became involved in groups who were then making sure that mothers in particular, who were really worried because there'd been instances where the police had shown up to people's homes, they'd dragged their children off. Parents didn't know what their rights were. They didn't know if that was correct. What do we do in that situation? So again, we ran a series of meetings with families up and down Wales to make sure that they were aware of their rights, particularly, as I say, with mothers. And we held these meetings in mosques and gurdwaras and all kinds of community spaces, making sure that people were, particularly people from South Asian backgrounds, were aware. Because, generationally, there's differences in how how people have dealt with experiences of racism and discrimination. So it was very important to do that. And then the next thing that happened was I was in my final year for university. A friend of mine had come to visit me. I was studying in Bristol. She left a copy of the Voice newspaper on my sofa, and I was writing my final dissertation at that time, which funnily enough was actually about Islamophobia in the West. It was a very new thing then. And there was an advert in the paper and for the TUC Organising Academy. And I had also seen that there was a job going for Bristol Council to do some community outreach. And I had my interviews for both of those posts on the same day. And I got offered both posts. And I spoke to my family about it. My mother was very keen that I go for the council job, and my father, having been been involved with the union movement himself, he was like, you know what, go for the TUC Organising Academy, because I think that it's time for change, and it's important that you do that. And I did, and that was back in 2002. And I literally, people say that you have to start from somewhere. And there was a time where, I say, like, I've literally been through the ranks. I started literally at the baseline, and gradually, kind of through experience and opportunities that were made available, but I had to fight for. It's not as if they were just handed over to me. Like, people say, "Oh, Shavanah, you're the General Secretary of the TUC now in Wales. Like, how did that happen?" I'm like, well, there's no walk in the park, and it doesn't mean that the further up you go that it gets any easier. It just means that your experience of prejudice and discrimination is different. So people may not call you the names directly to your face. That doesn't mean that there's no microaggressions.
Of course.
And there's the unspoken, hierarchical, institutional, structural racism we still face. So, I say to people, I'm often the only brown person in the room. Like, that is my experience. Yeah. My goals are that I don't want to be the only person, first and foremost. It shouldn't stop at me. And this is not even about, people say, planning for what happens after you. I want change now, and I want other people who look like me to be sat next to me at these big negotiating tables.
Of course.
I want to, so when those spaces are, people say, oh, well, how do you make those spaces? But I think that people have to make an active decision. So in the same way as now, working with Welsh Government to develop the Race Equality Action Plan, we've seen what's happened with COVID and the disproportionate impact on BME communities here in Wales and across the UK and other parts of the Western world. We know what the issues are. They're long-standing structural issues. There's an opportunity now for us to do something different. But I want something more than just a plan. I want us to be bold and to be quite brave in what we are aiming for. And we need to be very clear in terms of what we're aiming for, because if we're not, we will lose a number of people, particularly young people. Like, I know I had to leave Wales in order to even begin my, journey to where I am. I've come back, but I came back at that level.
Yeah.
This didn't happen in Wales. I was born in Wales, yes.
Yes.
But was I really made, as in the made bit? Did that happen here? No, it didn't. That happened elsewhere, where there was more diversity and there was more inclusion. Maybe not as it should be, but at least there was more opportunities for it.
Yeah.
But here, of course, I still experience imposter syndrome. I don't want that to be the case, and I want things to happen much quicker. I will. So my plan for even now is, I say to people, the one way that you can independently protect yourself at work, don't rely on your HR systems to work for you. Join a trade union, because that is your independent structure that will protect you, and it protects the interests of workers. In Wales, there's over 400,000 members of a union. There's 48 trade unions that are affiliated to the Wales TUC. Somebody like me is in the position of being the General Secretary of the Wales TUC. If there ever was a time, now is the time, because there are I think that there is a lot of goodwill, and if we don't take advantage of this kind of like the mood music, and we're not proactive in taking up those spaces and being bold in what we're asking for, we'll only see tinkering around the edges. We won't see goalposts genuinely like moving away. I don't want shift. I want change, because I don't want my children to have to go through this. I have my daughter's turning 8 soon. My other daughter turned 10 recently. They come from mixed backgrounds. My husband's actually Nigerian, almost unheard of, but it's happening, because just because we are South Asian doesn't mean that us as the second, third generations and so forth, our lives aren't changing as well, because they are. Our lives are becoming very unique. So, and my message really, as I say, is I always say particularly to young people and to young women, like, don't let other people box you off. Don't let other people make decisions for you. And we always have like red lines drawn around us, whether it comes from our families, whether it comes from our communities. Sometimes they think they're doing something good for you. But actually, believe in yourself, because if your gut tells you that something is wrong, then it's definitely wrong. And there are support structures in place to help you get over those barriers. And sometimes you do need an external person to have that conversation with your family, to explain to them that actually, your child is not doing something that's actually going to be bad for you, for the family. It's going to be good for their life, and it will be in turn good for you and for the rest of the community and the people around them. Like, this is going to serve best interest for many people. So take those chances and believe in yourself. And even if something doesn't work out today, doesn't mean that you can't do something else either. I think just simply, as I say to people, be brave and be bold and stand up for yourself, stand up for others. And, our greatest strength is always going to be unity and solidarity. As human beings, we have our differences, but there is so much more that brings us together. And if we can be more united, I think that there is nothing it's endless in terms of what we can achieve.